And yeah. All right, I'm gonna mute myself, and I think there's really yeah.
They'll look high and they'll look low. They'll look everywhere we go. But when the sinners find us, we won't hide. They'll come loud and they'll come fast. But we shoot first and we can last. Keep your rifle by your side. Singing, oh Lord, this earth was made for us. Singing, oh Lord, this sinful life just ain't enough. So we'll take a stand, 'cause we must protect our land. Keep your rifle by your side. They'll come day and they'll come night. They'll have our children in their sights. But if they don't have faith, their eyes are blind. They can scream and they can shout, but they can never smoke us out. Keep your rifle by your side. Singing, oh Lord, this earth was made for us. Singing, oh Lord, this sinful life just ain't enough. When we hear the voice, we know we have no other choice.
Hey. That's 10 here. Jeff, you might be muted.
Oops, muted. Yeah. Timed that one almost perfectly.
Yep. How are you?
Good. It's a little bit noisy here, but what else is new?
Yeah. How, here we are, watching the third Intifada in real time. Hello?
Yes.
All right.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Yeah, Renegade is saying that maybe the music was a bit low.
I just realized that. That was because I had it dialed down on my thing, and then I just looked at it, and yeah, it was. Renegade is right about that. So, yeah. As far as I know. As far as I know. That's because
Is that you?
I have my phone looking at the chat so I can see what Renegade's saying.
Okay. Yeah. Maybe a housekeeping note that I know that this is probably the 5th Quigley thing we're doing in a row, but we actually do have plans to do a non-Quigley content. Next week we're going to be recording something.
Who wants non-Quigley content?
I mean, I've heard a small minority kind of rumbling about.
Oh, really? This is why I don't pay attention to what the plebs say.
Yeah.
They'll have Quigley and they'll like it. Well, I'm hoping to kind of on my end. I know what you're referring to, Jeff. But I'm hoping to kind of do a couple of things that flesh out what Quigley says, like this narrative, but that are not Quigley episodes. Sort of like detours into some other topics that kind of flesh this stuff out. Because really, I mean, like what we're doing is we're setting up Quigley to tell us to see what Quigley has to say about the system and what the system is or isn't doing as, you know, manipulation, that sort of stuff of people. And there's a number of other places to look about that, or that are not like, oh, conspiratorial. I think they're just they're useful to know to flesh out the Anglo-American establishment in a way that was. They weren't intended to flesh out the Anglo-American establishment, but there's a number of things to bring in at some point, I think. But yeah. There's always more. There's always more stuff to talk about.
Mm-hmm. There was also a little bit of disappointment expressed last week that because we were talking about National Socialism, people were expecting us to give them a play-by-play on how the quote-unquote revolution is going to take place in 2024 or something.
Oh.
Like people thought we were going to talk about the current supposed rise of National Socialism.
So,
internet version.
Yeah. There was something that was not going around on Twitter a couple of, maybe a week or two ago, and it was some study that had revealed that, like, what you need is just, like, a dedicated core of, like, autistic guys who just refuse to change and just keep their focus, and that if you have like this like this small vanguard that is just absolutely dedicated to their view, that it will prevail. And so, not that we're equating. Yeah.
Well, I think one of the things that we're going to learn about today is that the other thing that's needed is the ability to exploit the weakness of the enemy. If I'm going to give a preview of what we're going to talk about today.
Kind of, yeah. We're not going to get into appeasement itself. We're going to get in.
Oh, okay.
This is how, like, the British set up. This is how the British society allowed themselves to be. This is how the British society existed in a way that Hitler could take advantage of them. But if you want to know how it's going to play out, in a way, if you look at the voting trends of Germany, in the 20s and 30s, not that we're equating Trump with National Socialism, because I think that's a stupid comparison. And that's not like, I just think it's not true. But so 2016 is like the first big victory for a new type of politics. 2020 is a setback. If the trend continues, 2024 will be a massive win for Trump. And if I'm going to say like where to look at the way that white women are going to vote. Because white women were the basis of support for National Socialism. I don't expect it to be in the same proportion, but I expect white women to vote for the Republicans in a way that they've never voted for Republicans for 30 or 40 years. And in part because, and by Republicans I mean MAGA, in part because increasingly the system is failing to take care of them. Now you can insulate yourself. The system can propagandize women. Women are more easily propagandized than men, I think. But I think that changes. That value of propaganda declines when they have children. And there are crazy white women out there. A friend of mine was telling me that one of his mom's friends has two boys, and she was saying, they need to take a back seat. It's like, well, you're an evil bitch. This is an English woman talking about English kids in England. And she thinks her English boys need to take a backseat to, Somalis invading England. Well, okay, so there's a number of women that are a write-off. But I don't know, even that woman probably, just with the right messaging for a couple of years, would come around. But I think the way to think about it, look, let me put it this way. MAGA doesn't need to convince white men. I think the white men are on board with MAGA to a large extent. Everywhere that matters. I don't really care about the way a San Francisco or a New Yorker, a Brooklynite hipster thinks about things. But then
apparently there's even a movement of socialists for MAGA.
Oh,
I've heard about recently.
Yeah, there's a guy on on Twitter. It's like Kaz or Kuz or something.
Right. Yeah.
He's a retard. If you told me, yeah, I don't want to. He's just retarded. He's not our guy. And what was I gonna say? But then all of this is all this said. MAGA's better than nothing, but it's not like good. It's just a step in the right direction, or at least a stopping of the rot. There's no MAGA British equivalent. So I think that the strategy in Britain is accelerationism. Let Labour win, because the people that would vote for the Tories are not going to come out and vote for them most likely in 2024. They're not going to vote for somebody else. They're just not going to vote for them. So the thing to expect for 2024 in Britain, because we have an election that has to happen in 2024 at the latest, the thing to look for in Britain is not a swing in votes, but a massive decline in votes. And the Tory party needs to die. It looks like it is on the verge of dying. This has been said for 20 or 30 years now, but it looks like it might actually suffer the worst electoral defeat in modern history, which is saying something because it just had the biggest electoral victory in decades in 2019, which they wasted. They haven't done anything with it. Is nothing coming up? Nothing's coming up. Here we are. So I'm going to. I did this. I did the thing that is supposed to has fixed it, but I'm going to do it again. But while I'm saying that while I'm doing that, I'll say, So the view is let the Tories suffer a massive defeat. Let Labour come in, and hopefully an actually right-wing party will form, and we'll get some sort of acceptable alternative. But again, the problem is, it's easy to get caught up in this and to start thinking about how do we win? And I don't know. I don't know if we win. I don't even know if we can pull this off. Or that we'll get anything good is what I mean. In the long run, don't put your faith in politics. And how's that? There we go. So, but today, this is chapter 10. Now, to give you an idea, the book is a little bit skewed towards the back end, the second half of the chapters. The first half of the chapters, chapters 1 to 10, take up 300 pages. Chapters 11 to 20 take up 500. So the chapters get a lot more meaty. This is the last chapter. This is one of the last chapters as part of the setup. The book really, I think the pieces really start together in chapter 12. So we got this and one more for next time. And then I think things really start to come together. But to recap, last time we looked at Germany, how the rise of Germany. There's an interesting story to be told there that Quigley doesn't really go into, but the sort of the way in which Germans are very dependent upon external civilizing factors, external stability. And that's going to be a big factor in this episode because of, we talked about it last time a bit. We're going to see it a little bit more this time. The way in which the English in particular are the opposite. The factionalism, how the various factions rose in the Nazi Party. You might want to think. I don't know. I'm just speaking off the top of my head. You might want to think like the Tea Party was a sort of a version of like the New Right and factionalism. And unfortunately, libertarian was not that captivating a message. MAGA nationalism, MAGA tariffs and protectionism seems to be a lot more appealing to Bob, the out-of-work steelworker, than libertarianism. So, if you're looking for parallels, the conservatives of Germany kind of riding the tiger that the Quad, those four groups, the great landowners, industry, the bureaucracy, and the army, and how they kind of tried to keep the Nazis in line. That kind of will come into this episode a bit. And yeah, so this week is chapter 9, the British psyche, how that feeds into the Constitution. What exactly is Toryism and conservatism? The British Liberals, and the rise of Labour. And Labour kind of will come to replace the Liberals in the British system. And how this sort of setup leads to what Quigley calls appeasement. And I'll talk about a little bit about that when it comes up, but I don't know if you can say that there was appeasement or whether it was Britain buying time to rearm. Although Quigley would not find that a convincing argument. But that is chapter 12, I think, that we'll talk about that. So, and if people want me to try and extrapolate connections with what's happening now, they just have to ask me and remind me. So Jeff, did someone say this to you after the fact, after we recorded, or was it something someone was saying in the stream?
It was afterwards, yeah.
If you remind me as I'm saying stuff, how this might apply today, but I don't really know that that's the point. The point, there's two. You can try and do that. You can try and say like we're in the same period as this interwar period. We're in the 1920. You just have to look 100 years back and whoa, there we are. You can do that, but the other point about Quigley's not writing a playbook for. He's not saying this is going to happen again. This is how we understand where we are, and I know that this is episode 9 of what looks like it's going to end up being like 18 or 19 episodes. I don't know if that's too much, but I think it's interesting in and of its own self. It's worth knowing, and you guys are getting the sort of the highlights of each chapter, so you don't have to go and read them. But the other thing is, there's a certain amount of work that has to be put into this stuff. If you really want to understand something, I can sit here and say like, well, there's an elite controlling everything somehow. And everyone could go, oh, great. Well, what is that? It's like, well, I've given you the short version already. I've told you that there's an elite controlling everything. You want to know? You want to know what that actually is? Well, this is what it looks like coming to terms with that. It looks like sitting through a lot of stuff, because I would rather give a comprehensive view of how they got there, and in order, I believe a historical approach is the best approach. I don't think it makes sense describing the WEF and the Council of 300 as they are now and just leaving it at that, because it's like, okay, but because the next question is just, how did they get there? Well, I'd rather tell you how they got there and just be patient and then see where we are. Do you know what that's my approach. And I think ultimately you'll just end up wasting more time if we do, here's the short version, here's the slightly less short version, here's the slightly less short version. I just go, if you want to know about this properly, just start with the long version. So I think the payoff is nearly here.
Yeah, I found that in my process as well, where I've been trying to work backwards the whole time. So WEF, so what came before WEF, et cetera, and it leads down all of these kind of rabbit holes and divergences that are kind of difficult to piece back together. They got to go down all these different historical branches. Whereas this is the first time I'm encountering like the approach from the other direction, which I think is pretty helpful.
If you want to make the ultimate branch, this I'll tell you all now what I think the biggest trunk in the system is. These are people who have the intellectual lineage that originated in pagan Egypt and has communicated itself through the ancient Greek world, the classical world, the Islamic world, the Byzantine world, the Renaissance world, into modern Western Europe. You're dealing with pagans. That is fundamentally what it is. It is and I'm not throwing all pagans under the bus. I think that there's an interesting conversation to be had about what kind of relationship Christians can have with modern pagans. But there's a certain type of Gnostic pagan that is what we're dealing with, and that is what someone like Klaus Schwab is, and it's someone like, I don't know.
But now you're opening up a trunk that's beyond the scope of Quigley.
Right. But if you the ultimate, there's something to be done there now, right? Because where did we really start? Well, the trunk that really runs through Quigley is the Anglo-American establishment, and we're starting with Quigley. But so what? One of my goals, for the goals that I want to communicate, is how the Anglo-American establishment plugs into that lineage that I've just described. But, that's the spoiler. That's the ultimate spoiler. This is all Hermeticism, as in Hermes Trismegistus. What we're struggling against, what we're fighting against, is a line of thinking descended from Hermetic philosophy that hates the world and is trying to ascend. And as a Christian, I think that is a mistake. That's Gnosticism. The point is not to reject the world. The point is to wait and to build the kingdom as best we can, and to wait for God to bring the world and the spirit back into line. That's really that's the big spoiler. If you want a spoiler, that's the ultimate spoiler that I have so far. Anyway. the British, the British psyche. Now I've just said that, right? The training that the British go through, the British psyche is not one that obviously lends itself to what I've just described. The British are really not understood by Americans, Quigley says. My mom is English, and you can hear it in her accent. And people will come up to her in America and say to her, "Oh, you're English? I love the English. They're so polite. Oh, I love them." Oh, like they have this image in their head of like some quaint little village, and everybody's friends with everybody, and they think that's what politeness is caused by. Politeness is caused.
Hugh Grant, and Emma Thompson. That's what we think of when we hear British.
Sort of slightly charming, bumbling Hugh Grant, right? The British are not polite to one another because they like one another. The British are polite to one another because we all hate each other. And what we want is just to be left alone. The dream of the Anglo is to be left alone. Which is why, in some ways, you can say that, like, Canadians or Australians or New Zealanders are what the Englishman looks like when he's allowed to thrive. Now, you could say to me, well, Bucklander, but those are some of the most paused countries on Earth, and look at what they did during the pandemic. Yes, you're absolutely right. But why would you bother trying to undermine Croatia or the Czech Republic? If you want to undermine somebody that's the group that stands for freedom, the first group that you would undermine are the English-speaking peoples. So I don't think it's a mistake that in 2023, the English-speaking countries are some of the most paused. I think that's intentional. That's part of the plan, because once you can destroy the English-speaking peoples, the rest of the world is there for the taking. So the British, though, are very weird. The English are very weird. I think I'm gonna save that for the end. The difference between British and Englishness. Really, I am talking a bit more about the English. Quigley says English. This is a bit more like the British elite, which often are English, but they're really a bit more British. It's hard to describe. I'm going to try and describe it at the end, though. Blotto, you're absolutely right. A lot of English people will say to me, like, "Oh, America was weird. Everyone was like really friendly." They don't have like this code of politeness that the English have. They're just super bubbly friendly, especially once you get out of the coastal cities, right? Everyone's like, "Oh, you're from England. What are you doing over here?" I can't comment about Canadians. I think Canadians would be pretty friendly, but I don't know. So, if you remember last time, we talked about how the Germans are very dependent upon external systems to inform their behavior. It's why they look for status. It's why they look for rank. They want to know who to look to when a decision needs to be made. The English are different. The British are different. The system of civilization is carried within every British person, within every English person. This is dated language that I'm using. When I say this, I don't mean every English person today. I mean every English person in the 1930s would have had, in some sense or another, had this little piece of civilization that he carried around with him. Yeah. And this is particularly true of the upper class. A lot of people, very, very popular to trash the English upper class, they died in the highest percentage of any group in the First World War. You couldn't dodge military service. It would have been social suicide to avoid military service. The only way that you could get out of military service would be that you had particularly high capabilities that the civil service might need. And even then, it was sort of like, well, or especially if you were the older son, you might avoid it by going to the civil service. But no one thought about avoiding military service. It would have been, to a large extent, unimaginable because you were conditioned. There's this sense in England where you'll say something like, again, this is dated language. I'm a complicated individual, right? I'm American and I'm English. And a lot of my Englishness I have learnt from books and media and older people. So when I talk to English people today that are my age, I feel like, how are you English? They don't represent what I think of as Englishness. So when I say this, I mean like my grandparents and their friends, or older media that was made for them, something like Dad's Army, which is a sitcom about old guys during the Second World War who were like part of this volunteer militia. I can't remember, what was I saying? What was this about? So it's very difficult to talk about the English. I'm talking about the English again in a very dated way. This is what the English were. It would have, I can't remember what I was saying, but so the Constitution, in many ways, is a culturally learned disposition. People will say, and this is Quigley now, people will say that the British have an unwritten constitution. This isn't true, according to Quigley. To use the word constitution to an American means a document that cannot be superseded by anything else. And in order to alter it, it is a very lengthy and difficult process. And it governs every other document in every other legal precedent has to conform to the Constitution. That is not what the English Constitution is, if there was a Constitution, because that can be changed by Parliament much, much easier than the American Constitution can be changed. And so, in a way, the British Constitution is the will of Parliament. Now, why that is important, why the British psyche is important for that is whatever the sitting Parliament is disposed to do in their psyche, whatever they've been trained to do, will inform the decision that they make. So you can't separate this culture from the Constitution. And education is the biggest part of this. I'm not sure if I go into this in the next slide. Fine. This is so the upper class in England. There's a lot of the class system is very nuanced over here. There's 5 or 6 sort of aspects to government. There's the lords, the commons, the courts, the monarchy, the civil service, and the cabinet. The lords was the body of aristocrats with titles, the ones who actually had the title, sitting in the upper chamber, and they had a veto. They lost that veto in just before the Second World War, or just before the First World War, or maybe just after the First World War, when Lloyd George tried to pass this healthcare bill, or a welfare bill, or a budget that was going to be very progressive by the standards of the time, and the Lords kept on vetoing it. And the Lloyd George was a liberal, and the Lords have always been distinctively Tory, at least the aristocrats, the ones with titles. And what happened was George V was increasingly embarrassed by the inability of the government to pass this budget, because the Lords kept on refusing to vote for it. So what happened was George V said to the Lords, if you don't pass this budget, I'm going to create 600 or something new titles, and I'm going to give them out to the liberals, and I'm going to flood the chamber with liberal lords in order to pass this bill. You can do that. We can do that, or you can pass the bill. And the lords, because they thought that would be an embarrassment to the king, and also because they didn't want to flood the chamber with people who would be uncouth, nouveau riche guys who were always coming into the system, but never en masse like that, they passed the budget. And a few months later, or a few years later, they were effectively forced to sign their own death sentence by passing a bill that said that they no longer had the right to veto. This then changed. But they did have the ability to delay a bill up to 2 years. This was then shortened in the 50s, I think, sometime after the Second World War, down to a year. So now what the Lords has become is a house of legislative review. And also what's happened is the introduction of what are called life peers, who don't have a aristocratic title, but they're given the right to sit in the house and until they die, and their children do not inherit the right to sit in the house. The Commons is the group that is based off of population. They elect, there's 600 and something MPs based off of population. The cabinet is the government, selected from the Commons and the Lords. The Commons is preeminent over the Lords, as I've said. But Lords can...
So without the power to veto, what power do they have left?
The Lords, well, they can delay. And the other way that the Lords...
For a year.
Yeah, and they can attach amendments that also make it difficult to pass bills. The other use that you can use the Lords for, although no one really does this, is you can kind of create an all-star government if you wanted. Because if I was elected prime minister, I could go, hey, Laurentian, you're now a life peer, and you can, and I could then bring in Lord Laurentian as my chief, my minister for agricultural affairs, because he's a lord. Because to be in the cabinet, you have to be in the Lords or in the Commons. The courts are the courts. The monarchy is the monarchy. The monarchy has the right to veto a bill, but the monarchy has not used the right to veto a bill since the reign of Queen Anne, like 300 years ago. And it's debated whether or not the king actually has the ability to veto a bill. I doubt they will. I doubt King Charles will. It would be pretty awesome if he did. I would love it. And I would, because the parliamentarians this time around would not be based Puritans, but would be paused, blue-haired SJWs. I would definitely be a royalist this time around. And then there's the civil service, and the civil service is quite important because they're the people that implement everything, and all of these things were distinctly Tory. So how do you make a classic Victorian Tory? Well, I think I talked about it last time. In England, public school is not public school like it is anywhere else. It doesn't mean publicly funded. It actually means private school. But why it's called public is because the boys were educated as a group, publicly, instead of being privately educated. To be privately educated meant you had a one-on-one tutor who taught you in private. The public school system, the public education in Britain cultivated a set of values that imprinted upon them. They were making with each boy that came out of a public school in England, you had another brick for empire. The three things Quigley says that are important to understand about this was, one, the education was not vocational. They were not training anyone in economics or accountancy. They were teaching these boys Latin and Greek. They were teaching them not very practical mathematics. They were teaching them high culture, because it wasn't about what are you going to do afterwards. It was more like, how are you going to do it? And Quigley says that so I'll finish this up. A big part of it was a moral education. And what that meant more than anything else was fairness. And I'm going to come back to that. And lastly, it was not about the truth. It's not about what's true. It was about how to behave and how to operate. Now, there's an excellent account on Twitter. It was one of my favorite accounts. His name is Druktha Kunli, and he's been posting stuff about, in particular, about language, and he gives the example of, in African language, in Zulu, there's no word for promise. What the Zulu word that's used for promise translates as is, maybe I will, maybe I won't, I might try to do this. For Europeans, to say nothing of the English themselves, that's not what promise means. Promise means I endeavor to undertake this thing. I have been thinking about the problem that we're having, particularly with the global South, is the global South doesn't have a sophisticated enough language to be able to deal with advanced civilizational concepts. I would expect East Asians, I would expect Western Europeans, and perhaps subcontinent Asians to, and maybe the Arabs, I don't know, to be able to participate in this sort of civilizational project. As I think about the language limitations of the Zulus, I'm not surprised that South Africa is in the state that it's in. Why do I say this? Well, there's an interesting story that's come out about a Italian guy who's been fired from his job because he refused to fly. He's a researcher at let me see. He's a researcher for a like the World Economic Fund or something like that. And anyway, he's been out in Papua New Guinea, and he says that here we go. Gianluca Grimalda, and he's been out in Papua New Guinea, and Papua New Guineans have a word for Europeans, Gaiman, which translates as liar. And when he undertook his research, he promised the Papua New Guineans that he wasn't going to fly, and previously his employer had been okay with this, but he's not going to fly. And even though his employer said, if you don't get back in 2 weeks, you're fired, he still didn't fly because he didn't want to be proven to be a liar, a guyman to the Papua New Guineans. Well, I don't know if that holds anymore in light of the way I've been thinking. I think that this sort of the lying that Europeans do is misunderstood by the global South. They call it lying, whereas for the Europeans, it's more like constitutionalism or process, or that like that the natives cannot appreciate what the Europeans are doing. And for the British, one of the most important, the most important value is fairness. And why I've just settled the last 2 or 3 minutes is because the average individual in the global South, the average Arab or the average Sub-Saharan might say, what do you mean? The British aren't fair. The British don't know anything about being fair because, they did this or they did that. I think that is another problem of language, or an inability to be objective. I think last time I talked about one of the things I think that is one of the best ways to understand the English is cricket, and that in cricket one would hope that if you were out, that you would call yourself out rather than having to be called out. Or if you were out but no one realized you were out, you would still sort of put your hand up and say, no, fair play, you've gotten me, that was well bowled, something like that. So fairness is an incredibly important concept, and I don't know that it's really understood, because you might apply fairness in a way that bends or breaks other notions of justice. You might say, well, yes, I know this is yours, but look, it's fair to give a little bit of yours to somebody else. I'm trying to think of a good example. You might say Israel, right? The British sort of looked at the world and they thought, well, this isn't sporting that I mean, there are other reasons why the formation of Israel came, but you might think that in part of the motivation was, well, look, it's not sporting that the Jews don't have a homeland. They deserve a nation, and it's a bit unfair to the Arabs to take some of their land, but on balance, it would be unfair for the Jews to not have a homeland. And you might respond, well, Palestinians aren't just Arabs, they're distinctively Palestinians, but maybe. So fairness, I think, is misunderstood. It's not social justice, but it's sort of playing the game in the right way. I don't know that my example of Israel is a good one, but it's the first thing that sort of comes to mind. And the fairness...
Is it fairness in the sense of expectation from your opponent, that if I play fair, then you're going to play fair? Or
Absolutely.
Is it how we ought to conduct one another,
yeah,
even as opponents?
And there is not an expectation of fairness from the masses. So Quigley uses this phrase, the classes versus the masses. I've never heard that phrase anywhere other than Quigley, but what Quigley says is like the class was the upper class and everybody else was the masses. So the working class, or even like the middle class. There was not an expectation that they would play fair. There also was not an expectation that foreigners would play fair. So when a Frenchman or an Arab does something that the English disapprove of, it's not, I mean, unless it's something particularly hard, it's not that they've done something wrong. It's just that they've done something a bit sort of not sporting. So the idea is not to try and get away with every little thing that you can get away with, right? Like there's a phrase I remember some kids had that when they played a game was that cheating was allowed unless you got caught. That is the antithesis of the British public school sense of fairness. You ought to be playing fair even when no one's looking. And that's because the rule of conduct is not applied to you externally. The rule of conduct is applied internally. And so what the British system was trying to do was to try and create a ethical individual. And ethics doesn't mean really right or wrong. That's morality. Ethic is a system to live by, which morality is situated within. Ethics can be based upon things that are not moral. Which is not to say immoral, but just they're not in that moral dimension. So this sense of fairness is firmly built into the elites. Now, this is why I have this sort of thing up here about Toryism. Toryism is a distinctively British approach to politics and to life. So I really think that, at least classically, to be English is to be a Tory. Now, there's a problem here, and I'm going to get to it later. The problem is, what does it mean to actually... I might as well do it here. I might as well do it now. The problem is that the English have been lost, to a large extent, to the idea of being British. Everybody else in the UK is allowed to have a sense of themselves. The Irish are allowed to be Irish, the Welsh are allowed to be Welsh, and the Scots are allowed to be assholes, as well as Scots. And they're also British. The English, it scares the shit out of anybody when the English start thinking of themselves as English. it's a very powerful identity that is willfully denied to the English people. There's a serious attempt to denude the English of any sort of sense of themselves. And it is not something that has happened in the last 80 years. It's much older than that. I think it goes back to the Act of Union. So this effort to create the British identity and replace Englishness with Britishness is something that's been going on for 200 or 300 years. And in fact, I think that when people criticize the British, a lot of the time it's very, very fair. What they don't understand is that when when they're criticizing the British, that is not the English. That's a people that have lost the sense of themselves. If the English were still English, a lot of the complaints the rest of the world has about the British would be non-existent. And where does the idea of Britishness come from? Well, it doesn't come from England. It comes from Scotland. Because the Scots, it was very important for the Scots to, despite what they say nowadays, the Scots really, really, really wanted to be in an active union with the English because they bankrupted their nation by trying to set up a colony in Panama, which was a disaster. So they asked for the Act of Union. And the English were kind of reluctant, but eventually they kind of went okay. And as a result, the Scottish Enlightenment at the time, guys like David Hume and Adam Smith, developed the idea of Britishness. Because Britishness is the thing that Scots and English both are. So now the English are not English anymore, we're British. And the Scots are British too, but they're still Scottish. And the Scottish identity continues to exist, and the British identity gets slowly chipped away. And it becomes this like Victorian caricature. I do not look fondly at the era of the Victorians as something praiseworthy or to be emulated. It's very austere. It's very romantic. It's very transcendental. It is not. I don't think it's Christian. I don't think that. There were certainly Christian Victorians, but I think that the Victorian British identity is the part of what goes hand in hand with the nonconformists that exist in the late Victorian era that go on to lose their faith and get very, very wrapped up in the occult and very, very wrapped up in the Anglo-American establishment. There's something coming down the line that I'm working on, which is about the relationship between the occult and the sort of late Victorians and the nonconformist Protestant groups that feed into that, and the Anglo-American establishment. So that is coming, but there's still work to be done on it. But there's a big connection there. So I don't think Britishness is a good thing, and I think that. But I'm sort of drifting. I've gone very far off my notes. Let me bring it back. So Toryism is, in a sense, very English, but not very British. Liberalism, I think, lends itself more to Britishness. So as Englishness declines, so does Toryism. And I think Englishness has declined, particularly in the last 80 years, obviously, as has Toryism. But and the other thing to understand about to be a Tory is there's no underlying philosophical approach. There's no ideology to be applied. There is just sort of fairness and an unwillingness to create a systematic approach to anything and to deal with things one by one as they come up, which is how you get something like British common law, English common law. As
Do
opposed
you think that the Tories today are a good representation of Toryism? Then?
No,
Or
not at
are they
all.
strayed very far from it.
They've diverged from it entirely. The only aspect of Toryism that remains is that they maintain power. It was said that the Tories were the party of government because they maintained it so effectively. But there's nothing distinctively Tory about anyone. We have a slight return to slightly more conservative values in the last few weeks from the Tories as they realize, oh, we're in big trouble if we don't like pull out something to give to people that's actually right wing for our base, because they're going to destroy us. So they're like, oh yeah, not everybody who comes here is a refugee, and maybe we'll do this, maybe we'll do that. But they're just doing that to get power. The Tories are, the last Tory, government, if I'm being really, really generous, was in the 50s or 60s, depending upon who you think it was. But really, like, the last Tory was Lord Salisbury, who is in this slide. We will tell you about him in a. So I don't they call themselves Tories still. They're not Tories. They're not conservatives. They're centrists. And the absolutely retarded thing is when people in this country are like, oh, I hate the Tories, right-wing scum. And you sit there and you go, how you're a moron. How do you think these people are right-wing? You think the party that's allowed 600,000 people to come into this country last year is a right-wing party? What are you talking about? They're neo-liberals, really, more than anything else. What do we have? So the Tories are present in all these 5 or 6 institutions of the British system, and Lord Salisbury's at the center of it. Lord Salisbury's a fascinating guy. I think he was a good guy. I'm inclined to think that he was, not a traitor. I said a minute ago that there's no ideology to Toryism. The Lord Salisbury doesn't like ideologies, but he thinks that we should think about how to approach individual things, not in a systematic way, but as those things ought to be treated individually. And before he becomes the heir to the family title, he is the second oldest son, and he has an elder brother who's very sickly. In England, there's something called courtesy titles, which are the titles that the sons of dukes or marquesses or viscount or earls use until their fathers die and they inherit the title. And they're called courtesy titles because, I'm owed some courtesy, or I'm giving you this title out of courtesy because of who your father is and who you will be. So the courtesy title for the Marquess of Salisbury is Viscount Cranbourne. And his older brother, at the time Viscount Cranbourne, is going to inherit. It's very, very likely, I don't think there was really much doubt that Robert would inherit after his brother, because it was unlikely that his brother was going to produce an heir. But in that time, he marries a girl that the family doesn't approve of, and he sort of gets disowned and loses. The family cuts him off financially, so he goes out and he writes thousands of articles. He's an incredibly prolific writer, and he writes about just about everything that you can think of, but in a way that resembles British common law. He's not creating a system. He's thinking individually about particular things, and he's developing particular responses to those things. There's no ideology. It's a particular response, right? And I'm emphasizing this because that is what Toryism is. It's particular responses. It's as and when things arise, we'll deal with that in a particular way. We're not going to pre-commit ourselves to an ideological position. We're not going to say nationalize every industry. We're also not going to say don't nationalize things. If something needs to be nationalized, we'll do that. If something shouldn't be nationalized, we're going to say that too. But we're not going to say nationalize everything or don't nationalize anything.
Yeah,
so
and ultimately, you can, in other words, it's anti-technical or an anti-technocracy.
Well, that's great. I hadn't thought of that, but that, and I don't dare let myself think about that now because we've already been going an hour. And I want to finish this before 1 a.m. That is amazing, Jeff. And I got to say, I'm gonna make a little note of that.
That was where you were going.
No. I feel like that might be one of the missing pieces that. I'm just sending this in our little WhatsApp. Thing so that I have it. And then of course his older brother dies and he becomes Viscount Cranbourne. Lord Salisbury, have you ever heard the phrase Bob's your uncle, Jeff?
Yeah.
It could be quicker than
I don't know what it means.
Quicker than you can say Bob's your uncle. Well, Lord Salisbury's Bob. Lord Salisbury is Robert Gascoigne Cecil. And Bob's your uncle meant we can get that done. Bob's your uncle, no problem. We can do that quicker than you can say Bob's your uncle. Because if Robert Gascoigne Cecil was your uncle, you were in. Lord Salisbury built a system which he was at the center of. He was related to everybody of any note. And if you were in a position of power in Britain in the late 19th century, early 20th century, odds were that you had some sort of relation to Lord Salisbury. So that's where the phrase Bob's your uncle comes from. And Lord Salisbury and that system of relationships is going to feed into the emergence of the Anglo-American establishment. Quigley in the Anglo-American establishment calls it the Cecil Block, and then the three groups that sort of come together are the Cecil Block, the Rhodes sort of group, and the Milner group. And the Milner group and the Rhodes group are kind of the same thing. And those two things make a sort of an alliance and push on, and the Milner group continues on, and the Cecil Block sort of disintegrates over time. Although even today, up until I would say up until Margaret Thatcher's government, you could still probably see quite a distinct element of people involved who were related to Robert Gascoigne Cecil, even like 100 years later. That network of relationships. The Anglo-American establishment now is not so much about those marriages and stuff, but it's definitely still a part of it. The elite marry with the elite. We will. I keep promising this. We will be getting to the Anglo-American establishment sometime around chapter 15 or 16, and Labor in particular have been trying to destroy this Toryism, this innate sort of sense of Englishness, of how to behave. But but they haven't been trying to destroy the Anglo-American establishment. They're just trying to destroy. They're not trying to destroy the people controlling things. They're just trying to destroy our civilization. That's all it is. And Tony Blair in particular has done more to encourage this than anybody else. So I think I deal with this in the next slide. So the big thing that comes out of this period is this period of like 1900 to 1939 is political transition in Britain. Initially this is about Tory versus Liberal in the late 19th century, for most of the 19th century, really. The thing is that Tories and Liberals were very much of the same class. They were the same people. Britain has actually a very small aristocracy, but quite a large plutocracy. This is what Quigley says. And that plutocracy, that wealthy elite, have much more easily been absorbed into the aristocracy than in any other country. And Quigley says this is one of the reasons why the British aristocracy is so successful. They're very prepared to bring in new people who can like buy their way in. So if you are a wool magnate who becomes really successful, or a cotton magnate in the 19th century, your son or your daughter will probably marry some lord's son or daughter, because that's just how things happen. And the Liberals are very much part of that same group that the Tories are. They've got slightly different values. The Tories are more interested in protectionism. They're more interested in defending sort of agricultural things. The Liberals are more interested in industry. The Liberals are more interested in free trade. The Tories are not super interested in empire. It's a very weird way that the empire comes about. Neither side is super enthusiastic about it for various reasons. There's a faction of the Tories that are more positive about it. Both have their reasons to like it. Both have their reasons to not like it. But what happens is that the Liberals sort of lose their power. And one of the things I'd like to do an episode on is a book called The Strange Death of Liberal England, which deals with this topic, because I think it plays into our set of concerns. But I won't talk more about it here. This becomes Toryism versus Labour. Labour really replaces the Liberal Party, and this is totally different. These are not guys of the right, of the upper classes. Now the Tories are dealing with working class guys who have been elected. This is in large part because Labour itself, not the party, but Labour, the economic force, has become more powerful. Unions are becoming a problem. And the Tories are fighting back against this. One of the things that happens is there's something called the Taff Vale case, which says that unions are financially liable for strikes that they advocate, which is a hell of a blow to a union. If you can say, that strike you called, you owe me £10,000 a day for that strike. But what happens is they undo that decision via a bill in Parliament, But the other thing that happens, and I talked about this last time, there's increasingly this sort of emerging compromise between union and capital. And that, well, okay, we'll pay your higher wages, and we'll just pass those on to the consumer. This is war on the middle class, because the middle class does not have unions, and the middle class is not represented by the Tory party itself. So, if you want to start drawing parallels, this is the time to start drawing parallels. The middle class is being warred upon by it's top, bottom versus middle, right? If only Laurentian were here. You still there, Jeff?
No, that's correct.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And this is where the modern system develops. The British do not have a party that represents the middle class. Toryism worked, I think, up until this point. But after this point, the middle class have never really been represented by any party. In part, they were kind of represented by Tony Blair and Margaret Thatcher. But it was usually about the party of the lower class and the party of the upper class debating with one another, and the middle class having to make a decision about who are we going to vote for. This is one of the things that sets America, which distinguishes American from Britain. America has two, at least classically, two middle class parties that are debating about the best way to represent the middle class. This is not the case in 2023, I know, but the Republicans and Democrats of the 60s are debating about how to better represent the middle class. No one is fighting for middle class support. And that party's not allowed to exist. The party that, in Britain that works for the middle class would be immensely popular because it would look after the British. It would look after the middle class, but that's not in the interest of the upper class or the lower class because they have this unholy union. Also in this period in the 20s, you had we've talked about it before, this lost economic decade, trying to preserve the gold standard. When Britain finally comes off the gold standard, things get better for it. It recovers. It does quite well in the 30s economically. And you start to see the rise of the British Union of Fascists, which is led by guys like Oswald Mosley. One of the similar things is that the Tories are certainly more friendly to the BUF than Labour is, obviously. You would not have fascism, you would not have the ideologies that emerge in Germany and Italy if you didn't have communism. The fascism is a reaction, right? It's a response to communism. You can support fascism for two reasons, as I see it. And you see this in Germany, and you see it in Britain. You can support fascism because you are an industrialist who realizes, hey, those guys are not as bad for me as the people that want to take everything from me. And you can support fascism for ideological reasons because you genuinely believe these people are going to make your life better. Those are the guys that are going to defend the nation. They're going to give me something to do. They're not crazy. Quigley, I'm not a fascist. But I will treat fascists fairly. Quigley is dealing with an idea of the British Union of Fascists that is no longer defensible. The There's a guy on Twitter who's done a couple of really good threads about this, UKipper. The notion that the British Union of Fascists were violent thugs isn't true. They were supported by the Tories. That much is true, as Quigley says. But the British Union of Fascists are actually quite good at following the law and being like an extension of adapting English values into the modern world. And people may disagree with that, and they'll often point that the one thing you'll hear about is like the Battle of Threadneedle Street. Well, what was the Battle of Threadneedle Street? Well, they'll tell you that the Battle of Threadneedle Street was when the people of East London said, "No, you big mean fascists, you can't come in here. You can't march through East London." And there was a riot, and the fascists were to blame. Well, the special branch of the Met Police, the Metropolitan Police, said in a number of places said, yeah, actually, it wasn't the fascists that were the problem. It was the anti-fascists. It was the Marxists that were the problem in Threadneedle Street. And they, so there's something to be said there as well. One of the episodes I'd like to do would be a deeper dive on Mosley and the BUF, because I think that they're interesting. I think that but with all these things, it's wrong to think that like, oh, the BUF are the good guys or the BUF are the bad guys. Everybody's being used. This system that we're living in, this technocratic system that we're living in, everybody's being used. You think Klaus Schwab, you think I need to learn some. You think Bill Gates is like right wing or left wing? That doesn't make any sense to me. I don't think you can say they're a political orientation. And so if you're gonna, you can't sit there and you can't say like Labor is with Klaus Schwab and the Tories aren't. No, they're both controlled by Klaus Schwab. They're both controlled by Bill Gates and Epstein's and Bezos and people you've never even heard of. So it's a mistake to look at one party or another and think like they're going to save us. The solution to this is not political. If we have a solution to this problem that is not eschatological, it will be revolutionary in a way that is not political, which is difficult to articulate beyond that.
Well, also, as you were saying earlier, that these people are alchemists, right? Their project is this breaking down of the world order that's established by God. Even in their view, some of them might even think that the world, the created order that we exist in, is established by the Creator, and their attempt is to kind of take that for itself, right? Because one of the pursuits of alchemy is the Philosopher's Stone, which is this attempt to breaks everything down into like the core essence of what gives it its kind of creative force, the prima materia, right? And by doing that, they're able to recreate the universe.
Yeah.
So kind of take God's power for themselves to recreate the universe.
Yeah.
So it's not about left or right. It's about something, a much grander project. And at times, the right-wing revolutionaries are useful for that, and at times, left-wing revolutionaries are useful for that.
So just to wrap up, the BUF, right, is used by Tories to an extent, but this sense of fairness that the English have in general, and Labour, even though they're not of the same class, Labour show up in Parliament, and they very much try to make this effort of being like, we're not going to live down to their expectations. We're going to try and exceed the Tories' expectations. We're going to try and play by their rules. We want to prove to them that we belong here. They're not the Squad, right? They're not Fetterman showing up to the Senate in a hoodie. They are like a different age. They're aspirational. They're trying to better themselves. And all of this means that the Tory mindset towards the BUF and the Tory mindset about fairness is how they can dispose themselves towards Germany and Hitler. They don't think that Germany has been treated fairly. They think that Germany has been exploited by the French. And they don't like it. They think that, it's just not fair. And they also think that they can sort of use Hitler. They think that they can negotiate with him. This is a bit of a caricature on Quigley's part, and I'm sort of like extrapolating the implications of what he's saying. But Quigley is, as I say, Quigley's writing in 1966, kind of limited to the scholarship's changed, but I'm giving you Quigley, and this sense of themselves, this education, and the politics. When you put these two things together, it is how you get things like the Munich Conference, where Neville Chamberlain flies off to Germany and he negotiates with Hitler, and they get the Sudetenland. I can't remember which one, what is given at the Munich Conference. I think it's the Sudetenland, the Sudeten Germans in Czechoslovakia. And he can get off the plane and he can wave this piece of paper and say, like, we have peace in our time. Because he's playing cricket, whereas Hitler's not playing cricket. Hitler's not English, guys. Spoiler. And this, it's how the English people can be taken advantage of. Now, there's more to be said. The masses themselves are quite committed to what's called collective security, which is the view that we should stamp down Hitler ASAP. We should make a ring of alliances around Germany with the Poles and the Czechoslovakians, the Hungarians, if we can get them on side, even the Italians. Mussolini, I think, at one point is much more in the British camp than he is in the German camp, and the French. And if in 1937 or 1938 that ring had attacked Germany, the world history would be very, very, very different. But it's also wrong to, I think, engage in those counterfactuals. I don't know how fair it is to Chamberlain to accuse him of that. But the Tories were not that interested in collective security. The Tories mouthed the right sort of platitudes about collective security, but they never pursued it. And this is why these things taken together, as I've said, is the foundation for appeasement. We will look at appeasement in... not next week, but the week after. And the week after, I think we'll probably do 2 chapters. We'll do 12 and 13. But that is it. That's it for the British background.
Okay. I'm just trying to go back and get into, try to understand the Tory mindset at the time a little clearer. So did the Tories feel like they were losing their country, and therefore they were, in dealing with Hitler that way, they were thinking see, the Tory way is the way that works. They were trying to prove that the Tory way is the way to move forward because they felt like they had lost.
It depends what you mean by move forward. I don't know that the Tories really have a sense of progress. There, but there's a sort of there is a sort of sense, I think, in dealing with Hitler. And they say, well, this will come back up. I think Chamberlain does feel vindicated. That a sort of like Tory, a Tory approach still works, because one of the things that's happened is by the time he's dealing with Hitler, you've had the rise of labor, you've had the rise of the unions, the Liberal Party is largely gone. They still continue on in some way, and it's not obvious that Britain is not going to become step by step a socialist country just via not a revolution, but we're going to become socialist in a very British way. And the Tories can get back into power. There's a whole episode I haven't really talked about how they kind of the Tory establishment subverts a Labour government. I don't think it's important for our concerns. And I wouldn't be surprised if there's a sense of vindication from the Munich conference that, like, yes, see, it works. And and of course there's then Hitler goes into Poland, and Chamberlain declares war, and I can't remember what it is that triggers Chamberlain's resignation, but there's this sense that in 1940 that this isn't we can't go on with this. We can't have someone like we can't have Chamberlain in control anymore. And the choice comes down to one of two people. What's his name? Lord I can't remember. And Churchill. And the view is, well, what do we want? Do we want the one who's going to make peace? Who's going to sort of land this plane? Or do we want the one who's going to fight? And you might put on your tinfoil hats and say that it's not a surprise that Churchill won in 1940. But then what happened? Churchill fights through the Second World War, but there's a very interesting thing that happens in 1945, and it comes as a big surprise. Churchill feels very confident that he's going to win the election. There are these masses of British soldiers stationed overseas, and they have this Lord Halifax is the other guy, the guy who's thought to maybe be a bit more peace negotiated inclined. But all the British troops and the British people vote overwhelmingly not for Churchill but for Labour, because they're exhausted and things have to change. The British have, in the course of 30 years, have fought the two bloodiest wars in their history. The empire is disintegrating. That is obvious. The finances are flying away. And they vote for Labor, and they vote for a guy named Clement Attlee. And Churchill teased Clement Attlee incredibly. Unfortunately, I don't think they made a good decision. Not that I think the Tories in 1945 would have been much better, but the first thing that happens is the British get a hold of the Marshall Plan, which is the money that the Americans are giving Europe to rebuild. What does West Germany do with the Marshall Plan? It invested in its industry. What does Britain do with the Marshall Plan? It gives itself gibs. It gives itself the ultimate gib, which is the NHS, which is in tatters now. But what else were they going to do? The British were done. The British were exhausted. I'm inclined to agree with Peter Hitchens. I think to be English is to England is dead. England is dead. It is not coming back. If you love England, if you love what it was, if you loved what it meant, you can carry that with you. You can carry that around with you, and you can be this little spot in the darkness. But England is not coming back. We're already in the Dark Age, and what will come next will not be England. Hopefully, if we win, it will be good, but it will not be England. So don't fool yourself that you're going to get England back. You're going to get Britain back. You're going to get America, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, Germany, France. None of these things are coming back. They're gone. It's not to say that we won't win. It's to say that what will come next will be qualitatively different than the thing that came before. The process of gradual change at a certain point stops, and you have a leap, and we're in a position of leap. So in the way that like the Gallic tribes were not France, but France built off of them. That is what England will be to what comes next. And the unions and labor and the exhaustion of the British project and the British Empire, it hastened that. And then the Second World War and the First World War, the Americans taking control of the global system and stabbing the British in the back whenever it suited them, all contributed to the acceleration of this process. No, I agree with Quigley. I don't think anything new, really, any substantial historical trend changed by these events of the 20th century. They just sped things up. So.
Renegade has a question, but I think we'll go to Blotto's first. Blotto asks, what does France do with the Marshall Plan?
I don't know. I don't even know if the French take it. I think de Gaulle might have not taken it. I'll have to look in on that. I'll say this. There's a significantly underappreciated realm of thought that we're not plugged into that comes out of France. The French New Right. There's a reason why they're not translated into English. I would love to learn French. I'd love to translate. I think that would be some project worth engaging in, making pirate translations. Because if we can learn how to be a bit more French, I think we'll do better. In some ways, we don't want to learn from the French. We don't want to create this sense of like the Republic, and you just have to believe in the Republic. And totally like, no. The problem with French Algerians is not that they're Muslim, it's that they're not good Republicans. No, that's stupid. But the French right, I think, have a lot to teach us, and de Gaulle, I think, has a lot to teach us. De Gaulle, and by us I mean not Americans, because de Gaulle really championed a way of cooperation but independence from America. And he was very prepared to tell America where to go. The British just hoard themselves out to America. Literally. I hate what the ruling class of England has done to this country. I would rather have lost to Hitler than hoard myself out to the Americans. But
All right.
sorry. But yeah, I don't know the answer to that question, Blotto. But I think it would be quite an interesting project to be done. Sort of a history of a presentation of French political thought and history for our guys for like from like 1870 to today. And there's a lot to be learned there.
Mm-hmm. So for Renegade's question, we are actually going to go back to appeasement a few chapters later, right?
Yeah.
Because I realized like I've kind of mistitled today's.
I encouraged. That was my fault,
actually.
I think.
Yeah. So on Britain's failure to stop Hitler's expansion is the appeasement part of the book.
What was
Today
Blotto's
is more
question?
on Britain's psyche. That was Blotto's question was the French Marshall Plan thing.
Oh, what was Renegade's question? About
Do a quick summary on. Renegade wants us to do a quick summary on how Britain failed to stop Hitler's expansion.
So as I said, with the Munich conference, Chamberlain looks the other way, and at the Quigley emphasizes the fact that at the time that Germany goes into the Sudetenland, the Czechs are not happy. The Czechoslovakians, because it's Czechoslovakia at the time, are not happy about giving the Sudetenland to Germany. And I think they kind of it's strongly believed they would have fought had they known that they had England and France at their back. And if England and France had been at their back, other people probably would have joined in too. That sort of collective security, as I said. Now, one of the things that backs this up is that the Czechoslovakians by themselves at the time had a larger army than the Germans did. The British pressured the Czechoslovakians to give in. There's a problem, right? Like, how much do you believe in self-determination? And because that's a big part of the League of Nations and of the United Nations, that communities have the right to determine for themselves their course. Now, part of that is that communities within a country are allowed to determine whether they want to continue to exist in that country or not. The Sudetenland Germans were very pro returning to Germany, but their return to Germany significantly undermined the strategic position of Czechoslovakia, because with it went these quite strategic positions on the border of Czechoslovakia, which would make it much easier for Germany to invade. Incidentally, people will forget that when Germany finally does conquer Czechoslovakia altogether, Poland also takes a bit of Czechoslovakia. The Czechoslovakians are not happy about that, as you can imagine. Or it might be with the Sudetenland, when they hand out, like, 3 or 4 countries take bits out of Czechoslovakia all at the same time. It's not just the Germans. I think Hungary takes a bit, and I think maybe Romania takes a bit. I can't remember. I think it's 4 countries that each take a little bit of Czechoslovakia, the Germans, and the Sudetenland's the biggest. The idea is that, like, well, they at various points, Hitler steps things up. And the British could have said no. The French are like, he's stepping things up. Let's go. And the British are like, no. Come on. Calm down. And I think the French certainly feel very vindicated at the way that they react. And the British are always like, no, come on. And by the British, I mean the Tories. I mean the ruling elite are very much like, no, come on. You gotta let them have the Saarland back. The Saarland is this sort of like very coal-heavy region in the sort of the western side of Germany. And then they go, you gotta let they're just slightly increasing their army a bit, and so at every stage the French are like, come on, let's go. They're if we can stamp down on them now, and the British don't. It's thought that initially it's sort of like some sort of cowardice on Chamberlain's part, or unwillingness to destroy Germany. The thought is that the Tories viewed the Nazis as a bulwark against communism, and that we would be able to create like a hard border on Germany's west, and encourage them to go east. The problem is they don't share a border with the Soviet Union. One of the things that's thought is that Marshal Podolsky, who was the president or generalissimo of Poland, he and Hitler had a fairly good working relationship, and that if he'd lived a few more years, that he would have allowed some sort of transshipment of German armies to fight the Soviets. I don't know if that's realistic or not. But he dies, and the Poles get a very anti-German foreign minister, and he doesn't help the situation with the relationships on the eastern border there. And again, one of the things people don't remember, going back to self-determination and peoples, Hitler had a very strong sense of a mission to protect the German people. And the Germans in Poland, Poland doesn't exist before 1914. I mean, at least modern Poland doesn't exist before 1914. It's created as a result of the First World War. It comes back into existence. And a lot of Poland is really Germany. And there's a lot of Germans that are driven out of Poland. And a lot of them die. And people don't remember this. Basically, a big chunk of particularly Prussia is lost to Poland. The bits of Germany that go to Poland are Prussia. And they're lost. And so Hitler thinks he's protecting Germans, that he needs to go in and protect the Germans. And the British are not unsympathetic to that line of reasoning. But the British, I think, are also fairly against the way Prussia that bit gets divided, because there's this like German enclave around Danzig, but there's this Polish corridor to the sea that cuts Danzig off from the rest of Germany. Königsberg too. I think Danzig is an independent city, but Königsberg, which is one of the great German cities, is cut off. And Königsberg is what is today that weird little bit of Russia in the middle that's like cut out of Poland and Lithuania, and it's Kaliningrad, and the Russians destroyed that city. There's nothing. Occasionally, the Russians offered Poland and Germany to return Kaliningrad after the Cold War, and the Germans were like, "No thanks, dude. You've ruined that city." I don't think the Poles are very interested either. So anyway, the British look the other way, it's thought. But the problem with that line of thinking is that the British economy is very bad during the 20s. And it's recovering in the 30s. And what Chamberlain does by his process of appeasement is he lets the economy, he's buying time for the economy and for rearmament. I was in a pub one day and I was talking to a guy, and he said to me, my dad, he was an old guy, and he said, my dad made test beds for Rolls-Royce engines. Now, what's a test bed? Well, it's something that you can put a engine onto and see how well it's performing. Instead of having to put that Rolls-Royce, this is for planes, instead of having to put that Rolls-Royce engine into a plane, take the plane up and fly it around and see how well the engine is. You can just put it on a test bed, plug it in, let it run, see how well it's going. There's a great deal of variability in engines, right? Not every engine comes out the same the other end. They don't all produce exactly the same horsepower, even if they're made as similarly as possible. Now, test beds for airplane engines are a big bottleneck. The more test beds you have, the more you can be testing airplane engines that you can then be putting into airplanes. And this guy said to me, the thought that we were like appeasing Hitler, at least from my dad's opinion, was wrong, because the Ministry of Defense, there was another ministry, the Ministry of Aircraft Production, said to the company that my dad worked for, we have an open order on any airplane engine test beds that you can produce, which means that we will buy any that you produce. There's no limit on the amount of number of these that we will buy. And that was in 1937. And the view is the British actually, despite what clearly says, the British know very well what's happening. I suspect the view in the military probably would have been something like, if we go to war over the Sudetenland, the Czechoslovakian army is going to melt away. And we can't rely on that. We've got to buy time to protect ourselves. It was... but it's really hard. I don't know to what extent the British were really aware of the strengths or the confidence they had in the other countries around Germany. I don't know why. But that's what appeasement is. Sorry, that's a long-winded way of answering that question.
All right, I guess we could wrap it up there then.
All right,
and
cool.
We're going to be returning to that in a few weeks anyway, right?
Yeah. So next episode is chapter 11, changing economic patterns, which is sort of like how countries in the 1930s responded to the Depression and how these new like models of economics emerged. And I think that this is the last chapter for setting things up. From chapter 12 on, I think things really come together. So, yeah. All right.
What tune are you going to play us out to?
Oh, probably the same one. I'll have to find something different if you want something different.
Sure.
Well, now I don't know what. Now I don't know what to put.
Isn't there more on that Far Cry 5 soundtrack?
I guess there is. I've never listened to any other questions. I don't know.
Right.
I'm just gonna play. I'm gonna have to
away.
listen. All right. I'm just gonna play this again, and for next time, I'll find a different song if you want one.
All right. Yeah.
They'll look
This
high
is the
and
end.
they'll
Thanks
look
everybody
low.
for joining us.
They'll look everywhere
See you all
we
next
go.
time.
But when the sinners find us, we won't hide. They'll come loud and they'll come fast. But we shoot first and we can last. Keep your rifle by your side. Singing, oh Lord, this earth was made for us. Singing, oh Lord, this sinful life just ain't enough. So we'll take a stand, 'cause we must protect our land. Keep your rifle by your side. They'll come day and they'll come night. They'll have our children in their sights. But if they don't have faith, their eyes are blind. They can scream and they can shout, but they can never smoke us out. Keep your rifle by your side. Singing, oh Lord, this earth was made for us. Singing, oh Lord, this sinful life just ain't enough. When we hear the voice, we know we have no other choice. Keep your rifle by your side. They'll have bombs and they'll have tanks, 'cause they've got money in their banks. But we won't fall as long as we can fight. They'll go on to preach their hate, but they won't get past the gate. Keep your rifle by your side. Singing, oh Lord, this earth was made for us. Singing, oh Lord, this sinful life just ain't enough. When I see your face, I know I must protect my place. I'll keep my rifle by my side. Singing, oh Lord, this earth was made for us. Singing, oh Lord, this sinful life just ain't enough. When I see your face, I know I must protect my place. I'll keep my rifle by my side. Keep my rifle by my side. Keep your rifle.